HSA Prep, because now it counts.
Good afternoon. Welcome to HSA Prep. I'm Mr. Wilson from Surrattsville High School, and I'm here to help you this afternoon with sample questions for the LSN portion of the HSA. A lot of times students ask, what are some of the best ideas for doing their best on the government HSA? Well, I've put it into 5 easy to remember things to do. The first thing you should do while you're completing your government HSA is take your time. The people who have created the HSA have done a really good job of making sure that you have enough time to complete each section. They are quite generous with the time. It doesn't mean that you can spend forever on one single question, but what it does mean is that you don't have to race through the test and make silly errors. Generally, the government HSA is broken up into 3 sessions, each of a relatively equal amount of time. You have a generous amount of time each session with a short break in between. Use that time wisely. Watch the clock. Watch the proctor or the administrator of the HSA exam because they will let you know how much time remains. Use that time wisely. If there's 90 questions, for example, on a section, knowing that you have so much time remaining will help you use that time in a more orderly fashion. You can also do some of these other things. Try reading each question carefully. Don't just race ahead and try to figure out what the answer is before you've thought it through. Read the question carefully. Read each of the answer choices carefully. Oftentimes, the answer choices will look very similar. The people who wrote these answer choices, they're trying to trick you sometimes. They're trying to make them so similar that you won't notice the differences, and then you'll be confused. Because they want to make sure that whoever answers that question knows their material well. So reading the question carefully and reading the choice carefully will help you make your best answer. A third thing that you can do is for each question, ask yourself, what level of the government is this question about? Is it the state level, the local level, the national level? Knowing which level of government is being involved will give you a lot of information about how best to answer the question, even if the question isn't asking you if it's the state, local, or national level of government. Using that background knowledge that you have can help you answer the question. Similarly, number 4, you can ask yourself, which branch of government is this question asking me about? Is it the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch? Again, knowing which branch of government is being looked at in the question can help you answer the question better. You can do that because you know certain words or phrases go with the different branches or with the different levels of the federal government. You can use that information to make informed choices on your answers. And then finally, the thing that I think most students need to do, and they oftentimes skip, is number 5 here. Check your answers. You are allowed in the HSA to go back through a single section and look at those answers. Well, check them over. If you still have 5 or 6 minutes left before the end of the session, go through that session and check some of those answers. Make sure you bubbled in what you thought you bubbled in. Or if you're doing the test on a computer, make sure you've clicked what you have thought you've clicked on. You might have put down the wrong answer even though you knew the answer. Check to make sure that you have thought everything through. Make sure you've read the question. If there was a question that just baffled you, sometimes it's a good idea to leave that question until the end. Again, checking your answers can help you. Remember, there are usually 3 sections on the test. You cannot work ahead and you cannot work behind. but you can work within a separate section of the test. So check those answers before time runs out. I also brought some sample questions just so we could work through them a little bit and see which kind of answer choice you think you should have. Here's a good example of a typical HSA-style LSN question. The process of amending the Constitution is an example of federalism because it requires what? Is it A, approval of 2/3 of the Supreme Court? Is it B, unanimous approval of both the President and Congress? Is it C, unanimous approval of both state and local governments? Or is it D, approval of 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states? You may be asking yourself right now, I don't remember how to amend the Constitution. Even if you're not sure exactly how to amend the Constitution, if you've forgotten the steps involved, you can still figure out this question because you know what federalism is. So there's actually two ways to answer this question. Being well-versed in how the Constitution is changed or amended, or being well-versed in what the term federalism means. If I look through the answer choices, I can immediately spot that letter A isn't right. The Supreme Court. I know from LSN that the Supreme Court interprets laws. That has nothing to do with changing the Constitution. And I also know that there's nothing in the Supreme Court that requires 2/3 majorities. The Supreme Court simply votes the way it votes on different opinions about law. So letter A cannot be the right answer. So that leaves me with B, C, and D. If I look at letter C, unanimous approval, that means everybody agrees, of both state and local governments. If I remember correctly, though, local government, that has nothing to do with changing the Constitution. So that isn't going to be part of the answer. So having local and state governments agree unanimously is not part of it. Also, because I know the word unanimous means complete agreement, it would be pretty impossible to have all 50 states plus all the local governments within each of those 50 states agree on anything. That just is not possible. So C is also not the answer. So I've gotten rid of two answers already. So now I've got a 50-50 chance of answering this question correctly. Let's look at letter B. Unanimous approval of both the President and Congress. Well, that sounds pretty good. You would think to yourself, yeah, you want the President to agree to amend the Constitution, and you'd want Congress to agree. But there's two problems with this answer. First, is it likely that everybody in Congress is going to agree to anything? No, it's not very likely. And then also, federalism. The President and Congress are the same level of the government. They are part of the central national government. This is not an example of federalism. If it's not federalism, it's not the answer, so it's not B. That leaves us with D. So let's check and see that we've eliminated 3 wrong answers and been left with the correct answer. Approval of 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. Well, we no longer have that word unanimous involved, so that sounds a lot more possible. We've got Congress agreeing that we want to have an amendment. That sounds good. And we've got some states agreeing that we want to amend the Constitution. That sounds pretty logical. But also notice, Congress is the federal level, the national level of government, and the states are the state level of government. That's 2 levels of government. That's federalism. That means that D is the correct answer. So you can see that there are actually 2 ways to look at this question. You can either know what the requirements are actually to amend the Constitution, and it is 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. or you can just be really smart and know what federalism means. Okay? So that's a good question on the HSA. And again, taken directly from the HSA, and you can learn something about that by practicing questions like that. I want to look at one more kind of question here. This one has to do with criminal and civil law. The different kinds of law is another aspect of LSN. And it's one that students oftentimes think they know, but it's good to review nonetheless. The question says, which of these is the best example of plea bargaining in a criminal case? And they give you three options. A defense attorney requests that the police release a suspect from jail. B, a judge questions the police about their reasons for requesting a search warrant. C, a judge listens to a defendant's plea for leniency before pronouncing sentence. Or D, a defense attorney and a prosecutor negotiate the charges against a defendant. This question requires you to think back to the law part of LSN. Sometime during LSN, you learned about criminal and civil law. In the United States, there's two kinds of law. Criminal law, which deals with bad acts that either hurt another person or hurt society in general, or civil law. Civil law requires you to pay damages because you've done something either negligent or maybe you've broken a contract. So there's two kinds there. This is criminal law, so we're looking at crimes. In letter A, a defense attorney requests that the police release a suspect from jail. Well, that sounds like something a defense attorney would do, but is that plea bargaining? Probably not, because defense attorneys are always saying they want their suspect released. Just because they ask doesn't mean it's going to happen. Let's try B, see if that's any better. A judge questions the police about their reasons for requesting a search warrant. You should remember from LSN that a search warrant is required before you can go into a suspect's house or property and take something out. So if the police want a search warrant, they do have to see a judge to get it, and they have to prove that they have probable cause. But that has nothing to do with plea bargaining. So A and B don't sound very likely to be the answer. Let's try C. A judge listens to a defendant's plea for leniency before pronouncing sentence. Well, it's got the word plea in it, and plea bargaining certainly must involve some kind of plea. But there again, doesn't a judge usually hear a defendant say, please be lenient on me, don't put me in prison for life, just put me in prison for 15 years? Again, probably a judge hears that 3 or 4 times a day. That also isn't very likely to be plea bargaining. So if you think logically, A, B, and C don't make a whole lot of sense. Also, if you remember, plea bargaining is a very specific way to handle a criminal case. It happens at the end of a case. While the case is going on, before they have finished and sent it off to the jury, as the case is nearing its end, the two sides in the court case can kind of come to an agreement sometimes about what they want to see happen. They might say, we don't want to go on with this trial. It's going to be expensive and it's going to go poorly for one or the other side. Or they may know that they have the suspect on certain charges but not the other charges. So plea bargaining is something that happens when everybody has sort of looked at the case and they want to do something that will give a guaranteed guilty verdict, but at the same time give both sides what they want. And that's what D says. Defense attorney and the prosecutor, that's the two sides in a court case, they negotiate the charges against the defendant. And usually what happens is they negotiate some of the charges to something less severe so that the defendant will plead guilty to those charges, but serve less time than what he or she might be facing had it gone all the way through to the end of the trial. That's plea bargaining. Knowing some of the facts from criminal and civil law will also help you on the HSA. There's not usually too many of these questions on the HSA, but there's always a handful of them. And knowing them will help you do well on the HSA. Sometimes they ask you on the HSA some unusual questions, and these questions will throw students because they don't sound right, but they are certain actions or certain phrases that just sort of go with the Constitution or go with government, and you have to know them. For example, this one right here. The United States Constitution is called a living document, most likely because it does what? Well, if you don't remember the answer to this just off the top of your head, there might, again, be a way of thinking it through logically. So let's see if we can do that. Is the answer to this question A, because it outlines the government structure? Is it B, because it refers to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Is it C, because it supports every citizen's right to make a good living? Or is the answer D, because it can be changed when needed? Let's look at letter A and see if that makes sense. Because the Constitution outlines the government structure. Well, that's true, isn't it? The Constitution is what makes the government have structure. It provides that structure of laws to the government. But does that have anything to do with the document being alive? No, it doesn't sound like that. Anything can have a structure but not be alive. Let's see if B makes more sense. Refers to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That makes sense because it does say life, but saying life and being a living document aren't necessarily the same thing. But also, hopefully in history class as well as LSN, you've heard of this term or this phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you remember that that doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. It appears in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is something that our government strives for, something that the people in forming a government want to have happen or want to see continue. But it is not part of our Constitution. And if it isn't part of the Constitution, it probably doesn't have anything to do with making the document alive. Letter C, the Constitution supports every citizen's right to make a good living. Hopefully you know that that doesn't appear in the Constitution either. In fact, the Constitution says very little about citizens' livelihood or employment. If you know anybody who's unemployed, you know that the Constitution doesn't offer them any sort of support. In the United States, there is no right to anybody to make a good living. You make a good living hopefully because you've gotten a good education. Hopefully because you've made some good choices. That has nothing to do with the Constitution, so it can't have anything to do with the document being living. So letter D, because it can be changed when needed. Well, the Constitution can be changed when needed. That is true, because remember, the Constitution can be amended, and that's a change. Now, does that make the Constitution living? If I were to think of something being alive, isn't one of those aspects of being alive being able to change when you need to? I think so. So I think just by using common sense, you can remember that the Constitution is called a living document because it can be changed. Hopefully also, though, you remember that the Constitution is called a living document because of the amendment process. Because the Constitution isn't one thing, because it can change, it can grow, it can be amended, because it can be interpreted, that makes our Constitution a very successful document. That's why we have the oldest Constitution in the world. because our Constitution has been able to keep up with the people and the changes and the situations of our society. Our Constitution is alive. So that's two ways, again, that you can figure out the answer to that question. Here's an example of when the Constitution also comes into play here, and also when the HSA writers have decided to throw something new at you, but they haven't left you hanging or high and dry. They've given you some information so you can answer this even if you don't know anything about what is being stated originally. In Kelo versus New London, that's a recent Supreme Court case. It's not one of those 8 great Supreme Court cases that we've gone over. It's not one of those Supreme Court cases that you're likely, in fact, to have in your textbook and know much about. Unless you've been keeping up with current events over the past 6 or 7 years, you won't know this case at all. So how can they ask that? Well, they go on and they give you a lot of information. That's how they can ask this question. And if you can simply interpret what you read, you don't need to know anything other about this Supreme Court case than what is stated here. And then you can answer the question. Let's see how we do that. So in Kelo versus New London, the Supreme Court ruled that local governments could take private property to be used for commercial economic development. The Supreme Court's ruling in this case impacted the principle of, and they give you 4 options: A, equal protection; B, rule of law; C, popular sovereignty; D, eminent domain. So, let's see what is going on here in this case. Again, we're going to assume that you know nothing about the Kelo versus New London case. It was a very controversial Supreme Court decision. In the decision, one of the things that was established was that local governments have the right to take private property from citizens if they can show that they are going to use it for a good commercial economic development use. You might not think that's fair. That doesn't matter for this question. You merely have to understand that local governments are taking private property. You need to think now, which principle of our government involves taking private property? Is it equal protection? Is it the rule of law? Is it popular sovereignty? Or is it eminent domain? Let's figure this out. Equal protection. Hopefully you remember that equal protection involves those activities or duties of the government when it is accusing a citizen of wrongdoing. So it involves treating suspects fairly. It involves the right to a fair, speedy trial. It involves having a lawyer. Does that have anything to do with the taking of private property by the government? Probably not. How about rule of law? Well, rule of law simply means that all parts of the government have to follow what the Constitution and what the laws say. Certainly, there is a rule of law going on in this question. However, it does not specifically reflect the rule of law. It's not saying that local governments, unlike state governments, can do something. It is not saying that local governments now have this magical power. It is not saying that local governments get to abuse the Constitution. So there's not some sort of impact in rule of law here, really. C, popular sovereignty. Well, as I've mentioned before, popular sovereignty is a term that oftentimes confuses people. Popular means the people. Sovereignty means the right to make choices. So it means that the government comes from the people and that the people make the choices in the government. Private property sure is in people's hands, and it does have something to do with the government, but it doesn't have anything to do with the government being changed by what the people decide. So C doesn't sound very likely either. Then there's this weird term at the bottom, eminent domain. That doesn't really sound like much of anything. unless you've paid attention in LSN. Eminent domain is a very specific rule that is in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. Eminent domain is the right of the government to take private property. It used to be that taking private property involved using it for some sort of larger common good. For example, taking part of your backyard, which is your private property, so that the government could put through a safer highway. You might not like it personally because your backyard is smaller, but the government would be able to take that private property because the use of that safe highway would impact everybody, where your backyard just impacts your family. That's eminent domain. So D is the best answer for this. But if you were paying attention here, you notice that A, B, and C, all of these sound more like something that has to do with law or has something to do with decision making. The word domain, oftentimes people remember that domain has something to do with what you hold on to or what you rule over. And that kind of sounds like property. So knowing some vocabulary here can help you as well on this question, if you didn't know what eminent domain means already. But as you can see, you didn't have to know anything about the Supreme Court case other than what was stated in the question. And that's one of the nice things about the people who wrote the HSA. They didn't bother trying to increase what you needed to know in LSN. What they did is they give you information and they want you to interpret it. So if you have interpretational skills, you're going to be okay on the HSA LSN. Well, that's all I have for today. Hopefully these things have helped you to do a better job on the HSA. And remember, you have several opportunities to take the HSA this year. Use them so that you can do the best possible before graduation.